everyone. Today we're going to go through the final 3 chapters in Volume 1 of Great Expectations, which is from pages 118 to 152. As always, make sure that you've read these 3 chapters before you watch this presentation, because it will make everything make much more sense and you'll feel far more confident thinking about the topics we're going to discuss. These are 3 really important chapters with so much that happens within them. We could talk about them for weeks. But we're going to focus on 3 particular things in this video, and it's quite likely we'll come back to sections of this part of the text later on in the course to revisit and go into more detail. So don't worry if you feel like we've missed something out, although do feel free to send me any questions of anything that I might have missed. So the 3 things that we're going to have a look at are on the screen now. Within chapter 17 we're going to think about the fates and fortunes of women within the text, particularly focusing on Biddy, Pip's conversations with her and his treatment of her, and what Dickens is possibly showing us about treatment of women in society through these conversations. In chapter 18 we meet Jaggers again when Pip is given his Great Expectations, and we read the title within the text and get very excited about that. In this chapter we really must think about the importance of misreading clues and the blurred lines between assumption and truth, appearance and reality, and there's lots of links here with the Great Gatsby as well. And in the final chapter of this volume, the transition chapter, which takes us into volume 2, we need to think about what Dickens is revealing about the role of money and status, and how this affects the ways individuals behave themselves if they have money and status, or the way that they behave towards people differently based on their money and status. So these are the 3 main areas we're going to look at, so you can always come back to these as key sort of headings or titles for your notes. So we're going to start with chapter 17. So if you have page 118 open, that will be really useful for you. The question is, what does Dickens's portrayal of Pip's treatment of Biddy reveal about attitudes towards women's place in society? Well, there's 3 main things I want you to delve into in your own time. Women are static, they don't move, they're confined to domesticity, so they're confined to the household, to domestic chores. Think about Biddy. Miss Havisham, after she's jilted at the altar, is confined to her house for the rest of her life. Estella is essentially confined to be a domestic lady, and Mrs. Joe focuses very much on having been a homemaker and raised Pip by hand and of living in a domestic circle. I want you to think as well about how women in Great Expectations and in Gatsby are defined by the male gaze. We have male authors in both of these texts, and so everything that we learn about Biddy in this chapter is through the eyes of Pip and through his assumptions, through his observations, through his recollections. We never truly hear Biddy's voice. Even though we have dialogue, it's being recreated by Pip. So Biddy is sort of silenced and defined by how Pip remembers her. And finally, I want you to think about how strong women are broken by keeping the society of men, by their relations with men. Strong women are broken, sort of kept down, kept in their place, and social mobility is much less of an option for them as it is for men within these books. Okay, so on the next slide I'm going to show you quite a long and detailed extract. It's from page 118, the 3rd paragraph, until page 120 at the end of the 1st paragraph on that page. So I'll put it on the screen. You might want to pause the video and reread this extract, and I'm going to talk about some of the methods that Dickens uses in order to portray women in this chapter. So as I said, it's quite small, quite hard to read on the screen, so you might want to have page 118 open to start with Imperceptibly I Became. And I'll assume now that you've read this extract again in more detail, and I'm going to talk you through some of the key points, and you might like to make notes in your book so that you can come back to them later for an essay. So let's have a look. The first thing I want you to think about, as always, it's always a method with Dickens, no matter what extract you're looking at, is the role of this first-person retrospective narration from the mature and reflective Pip, and he interjects to comment upon and judge his own actions. Now sometimes in the book this is really close to the action, in the midst of a dramatic event being relived as young Pip, so for example the Christmas dinner scene, or sometimes he's far off and quite removed and distant and reflective, like in this conversation with Biddy. Okay, the key theme that we're picking up on here is eyes and looking and observing change in other people. Imperceptibly, I became conscious of a change in Biddy. So he's watching her, he's looking at her, he's assessing and judging her. And we get lots of that through description. So in that first paragraph, notice we have the triadic structure of her shoes came up at the heel, her hair grew bright and neat, her hands were always clean. So we have that anaphoric reference of the pronoun her, and these are sort of Pip's judgments, and they're to do with her appearance, women being judged by appearance as opposed to achievement. And Pip sort of becomes the snob that he hated Estella for. He says, she was not beautiful, she was common and could not be like Estella. So he uses that very same insult of being common that Estella gave to him and made him so upset. But she was pleasant and wholesome and sweet-tempered. So we have the polysyndetic list of 3 items there, and it's Pip's judgment of Biddy. It's not Biddy's presentation or portrayal of herself, it's Pip's judgment of her. So make a comparison here with the Estella theme and sort of social class restraint. So the same way that Pip was restrained by Estella calling him common, he's now restraining Biddy by asserting that she is common. Okay, and we notice as well that he focuses on her eyes at the end of that first paragraph that's on the screen. Sorry, I've at the end of line 8, which is not the first paragraph. There should be a new paragraph at "It came of my lifting up my own eyes from a task." Notice that he says that Biddy's eyes were thoughtful and attentive, eyes that were very pretty and very good. So it makes us think about The Great Gatsby and Daisy's eyes, but also the eyes of T.J. Eckleburg watching, and there's lots of links to be made between eyes and looking. And so it's when Pip lifts up his own eyes that he realises that that Biddy has been watching him and observing him in his work, and that sparks the conversation which comes in this dialogue. Okay, so notice how Dickens also uses parenthesis to insert the comments of older Pip. So I remember her being recently in mourning. This is a little parenthesis you could easily pass over, but what we recognise here is that a relation of Biddy's has died recently, and so when she first arrives with Pip's family, she's gone through a traumatic experience. She's gone through a bereavement, and Pip doesn't seem to recognise this until later. But he's filling in the gaps, which is something you don't get if you're getting the story told in the present tense. We're having our narrator fill in the gaps here. And then we start the conversation. So we have the use of dialogue to really reveal characters' motivations, thoughts and feelings. We get the speech of the young and naive and arrogant Pip, and then we get the reporting phrases of the older retrospective Pip. So we get that sort of contrast between the two. So if you have a look at page 119 in the third paragraph, we have the voice of the older narrator Pip. I was beginning to be rather vain of my knowledge, for I spent my birthday guineas on it, and set aside the greater part of my pocket money for similar investment, though I have no doubt now that the little I knew was extremely dear at the price. So he recognises that he was becoming vain, that he was basically, and his birthday money he spent on his books, wasn't really well spent. He didn't get a lot of knowledge for the things he bought, and that's older Pip sort of reflecting back, realising that he's become a bit arrogant, that he's become a bit snobbish, and he feels sort of guilty about this. Biddy's presented as very modest, very humble, and quite coy. She says quietly as she goes on with her sewing, I might as well ask you how you manage. When Pip has asked Biddy how she manages to keep up with him, she asks, well, how do you manage? And then Pip says, well, when I come in from the forge any night, I'm turning at it. But you never turn at it, Biddy. You never work on your knowledge. And Biddy very coyly says, I suppose I must catch it, like a cough, says Biddy quietly, and goes on with her sewing, when obviously she is working hard, she is studying, but Pip's too self-absorbed to notice. And so Pip's thinking that perhaps because he's male, perhaps because he's just self-obsessed, that he's the only one that could be sort of knowledgeable and wise. and doesn't recognise that Biddy is far wiser and far more knowledgeable than he is. And she points out to him that she was his first teacher. Pip doesn't seem to recognise this. Pip says, "You are one of those, Biddy," said I, "who make the most of every chance. You never had a chance before you came here, and see how improved you are." Biddy looked at me for an instant and went on with her sewing. "I was your first teacher, though, wasn't I?" she asked as she sewed. "Biddy," I exclaimed in amazement, "why are you crying?" "No, I am not," said Biddy, looking up and laughing. "What put that in your head?" So whether Biddy is crying or not is almost irrelevant. If she is, it could suggest that she sort of is feeling upset that Pip doesn't sort of recognise and value her. It could just be that Pip is mistaken. But he recognises that Biddy's come from low beginnings the same way as he has, and has made something of herself. So when Mr. Wopsle's great aunt had died, or in a more humorous way, overcome that bad habit of living, 6 lines up from the bottom of page 119, we notice that Dickens uses one of his repetitions in list form again. I recalled the hopeless circumstances by which she had been surrounded in her miserable little shop, and the miserable little noisy evening school, with that miserable old bundle of incompetence always to be dragged and shouldered. I reflected that even in those untoward times there must have been latent in Biddy what was now developing. From my first uneasiness and discontent, I had turned to her for help as a matter of course. Biddy sat quietly sewing, shedding no more tears, and while I looked at her and thought about it all, it occurred to me that perhaps I had not been sufficiently grateful to Biddy. I might have been too reserved, and should have patronised her more, though I did not use that precise word in my meditations, with my confidence. So here Pip is regretting not having sort of spoken out and said to Biddy how much he recognises that she had helped him, and he sort of arrogantly keeps it to himself and likes to portray himself as being more capable and more intelligent. So this presentation of Biddy is a very restrictive one. She's her words come from Pip's narration. She isn't the one with great expectations. Pip is. She doesn't have the same opportunities as him. She's expected to be sort of a domestic creature, and essentially Pip judges her differently because she is female, and the way that she is presented is first through her appearance and second through her sort of industry and her hard work. So something that's worth doing at some point is thinking about Nick and others' descriptions of Daisy Buchanan or Daisy Fay and comparing that with the presentation of Biddy here. Lots more to say about this scene, but I'm going to move on now. So let's move into chapter 18 and have a look at the importance of misreading clues and the blurred lines between assumption and truth, appearance and reality. Within this chapter, which is a really important one, is where Pip finally finds out his great expectations, and the title of the book is mentioned, very exciting for the readers, and this is the trigger point, the turning point by which Pip's Bildungsroman will really be shot forward and accelerated towards London, becoming a gentleman, becoming wealthy, all these things that we're sort of hoping for him. Now, in terms of the character of Jaggers, Dickens uses the tagging method to reintroduce him, namely the biting of his great forefinger, but also when we look at page 129, we see that Dickens repeats the description of him from when we've seen him before on Miss Havisham's stairs. His large head, his dark complexion, his deep-set eyes, his bushy black eyebrows, his large watch chain, his strong black dots of a beard and whisker, and even the smell of scented soap on his great hand. So we as readers should remember encountering these things before, remember who Jaggers is, and that leads to the misreading of the clue. Pip and us as readers misread the Jaggers clue and assume that Pip's benefactor must be Miss Havisham, because that's where we've seen Jaggers before. Now, added to this, the insistence on keeping the name Pip, which we know Miss Havisham was so fond of, further misleads us, and so does the fact that Pip's tutor is going to be Matthew Pocket, who is a relation of Miss Havisham. So all of these clues lead us to assume that it is her who is the benefactor, and therefore when Pip eventually does discover the identity of his benefactor is the convict whom he met in the churchyard in chapter 1, this leads to more shock and more drama. Now if we think about The Great Gatsby, we can link this misreading to Wilson as a particular example, who misreads the clues in the death of his wife, assuming that it must be Gatsby because it was the yellow car that ran over his wife, and he finds out Gatsby is the owner, and that leads to the murder-suicide at the end of the novel. So but there is a point of comparison in terms of assuming things and the truth. Now, Jagger's humiliation of Wopsle, when Wopsle is reading the murder story from the newspaper and all of the group decide that the accused must be guilty, teaches us about the dangers of jumping to conclusions. So there is a little bit of a warning in there from Dickens, and you only really appreciate the true genius of this chapter once you've read the whole text and you understand everything that's happened. When you come back and see all of the clues and sort of foreshadowing that Dickens had put in, it's actually quite obvious. So that's the genius of his writing. So within this scene, we see Jagger's sort of lay forth the task that he's been given to sort of relieve Pip of his apprenticeship. Joe at first accepts sort of no money for this and then becomes quite sort of angry at Jaggers, which leads Jaggers to leave. And then Pip's attitude changes as well. He immediately starts to become more snobbish and sort of look down upon those that brought him up. He recognises at the top of page 137 he doesn't want people to see him sort of in his new clothes and sort of being changed and coming into money, because it was they would make such a business of it, such a coarse and common business that I couldn't bear myself. So Pip is now judging those people around him as coarse and common, and he can't bear their company. So notice how the sort of tides have changed there. We notice as well at the bottom of page 137 that Pip recognises the first night of his bright fortunes is the loneliest he's ever known. So now that he's come into this fortune, he's actually come away from the social connections and sort of family connections of his youth. And sorry, just bear with me a second. When Pip's in his bedroom before he goes to bed at the end of this chapter and puts his light out and sort of sleeps fitfully, he sees Joe and Biddy speaking together in the garden. Knowing that they're speaking about him, he is now sort of physically separated from their society, which precludes him leaving for London and being separated from them for good. So within this chapter, it's really important to recognise the way that individuals change as soon as Pip has received his expectations. So we're going to move on to chapter 19. I was just checking there was nothing else I've missed with chapter 18. We're moving into chapter 19, which is the transition into volume 2. And we're going to have a look at the way that individuals change when they recognise that Pip's fortunes have changed. So what does Dickens reveal about the ways money and status affect attitudes towards different individuals? Well, there's a couple of main things to think about. Firstly, Pip becomes snobbish towards his own kind, which we've started to see in the previous chapter. But of extra interest in this chapter is how Pumblechook and Trabb's boy display sycophancy. Now, to be sycophantic means to sort of suck up to somebody, to change your behaviour around them, to win their favour, to then sort of become friends with them or to get favours from them, such as money or goods. So Pumblechook, remember, on Christmas Day certainly looked down on Pip and sort of looked down his nose at him and treated him quite badly. And we're also going to see the way Trabb's boy treats Pip. It's not actually Trabb's boy who displays sycophancy. I've made a mistake on the screen there. It's Trabb himself who displays sycophancy. Trabb's boy actually doesn't treat Pip any differently at all. He looks down on him. But once Mr. Trabb realises that Pip has come into money, then he sees him as a customer and a way to make money. And so he, sells him his suit and treats him in the best way possible. So we're going to see that in an extract we'll look at now. Now we can link that to Gatsby. during Gatsby's life, lots of people care to make his acquaintance, care to come to his parties, care to sort of benefit from his wealth. But as soon as he's dead and his money and status have gone, no one cares about him. No one comes to his funeral and he's completely forgotten. So we see that in reverse. Pip goes from nothingness to something, whereas Gatsby goes from riches to rags. Let's have a look at Trabb's boy. So again, this extract is quite small on the screen, but you'll find the extract begins on page 142, and it begins but morning, which is about halfway down page 142, and we go over a couple of pages of the book here. Now, the main thing to recognise is that Pip has come into town to buy new clothes, clothes worthy of a gentleman rather than a blacksmith's apprentice. And as he goes into Mr. Trabb's shop, Mr. Trabb doesn't even think it's worth his while to come out and speak to Pip. He's buttering bread, he's quite happily having his breakfast, doesn't seem at all bothered that Pip has arrived in the shop. As soon as Pip quite coyly says to him that, Mr. Trabb, I said, it's an unpleasant thing to have to mention because it looks like boasting, but I've come into a handsome property. A change passed over Mr. Trabb. He forgot the butter in bed, the bed of bread that he'd made for it, got up from the bedside and wiped his fingers on the tablecloth, exclaiming, Lord bless my soul. And it's in this point that Mr. Trabb's behaviour towards Pip changes, and he treats Pip in a much more deferential way to get money out of him. But Mr. Trabb's boy has been sort of sweeping over Pip. As he's sweeping the shop, it's a humorous scene. He's sweeping the shop floor and he just completely sweeps over Pip and just ignores the fact that he's there, sort of brushes over his shoes, knocks into him, and creates quite a bit of a scene, really, as Mr. Trabb's boy previously would have seen himself on a par, on an equal level as Pip. He's now resentful of the fact that Pip has come into money. So notice the techniques that Dickens uses to create the humour in this scene. We're going to have a look at some things on page 143. Mr. Trabb calls Pip, my dear sir, as he respectfully bends his body, opens his arms and took the liberty of touching me on the outside of each elbow. Don't hurt me by mentioning that. May I venture to congratulate you? Would you do me the favour of stepping into the shop? So he's completely changed his way of speaking. So the dialogue is a really key way we can see that his behaviour has changed. But what's also really humorous is the way he speaks so softly and gently and kindly to Pip, and then so harshly and cruelly to his working boy, Trabb's boy. So in one sentence he can change. So we can have a look at that here on the fourth paragraph down on page 143. Mr. Trabb's boy was the most audacious boy in all that countryside. When I had entered, he was sweeping the shop, and he had sweetened his labours by sweeping over me. He was still sweeping when I came into the shop with Mr. Trabb, and he knocked the broom against all possible corners and obstacles to express, as I understand it, equality with any blacksmith, alive or dead. Hold that noise, said Mr. Trabb with the greatest sternness, or I'll knock your head off. Do me the favour to be seated, sir. Now this, said Mr. Trabb, taking down a roll of cloth and tidying it out in a flowing manner over the counter, preparatory to getting his hand under it to show the gloss, is a very sweet article. I can recommend it for your purpose, sir, because it really is extra super. But you shall see some others. Give me number 4, you, to the boy, and with a dreadfully severe stare, foreseeing the danger of that miscreant's brushing me with it or making some other sign of familiarity. So, in that quite badly read by me paragraph, we can see how the way Mr. Trabb speaks to Pip is very careful, very genteel, and the way that he speaks to his boy is full of imperatives. Hold your noise. Get me that. Get me number 4. So hold and get, these imperative verbs. He's very bossy towards his worker, and he treats him in a completely different way to Pip. And that carries on throughout the scene, and we see Mr. Trabb basically trying to sell Pip as much as he can, and try to get Pip's custom in the future as well, saying, will you come back and buy your suits here, even when you're a rich London man? And so what we can see is that the behaviour of Mr. Trabb changes because of Pip's status and his wealth, and Pumblechook does the same. So Pumblechook welcomes Pip to his house, and again treats Pip completely differently, and tries to take some sort of credit for Pip's fortune, saying that he sort of orchestrated it with Miss Havisham, and because he was the one who brought back the first message of her wanting him to play at the house, that he's somehow responsible. So Pumblechook is quite happy to take the credit for something he had nothing to do with. And again, that's because of his desire to be associated with wealth and status. So I've rambled on probably for long enough here, but it's important to look for that in this chapter, and to recognise that Dickens's methods are always the same. So he's still using dialogue, he's still using description, he's still using repetition, he's still using particular vocabulary choices, all for the same reasons that you have on your big A3 sheets that we did before we left school. So look carefully for those and see if you can extract some key quotations and extracts to really focus on. Okay, so just one last thing that I want to talk about before I give you a question to think about. If you turn right to the end of this volume on page 152, I want you to have a look at the final lines or so. We're going to think about symbolism. Dickens, in this final chapter or two in this volume, has used circularity of setting to emphasise the alteration in Pip. So he goes back on a walk through the churchyard and the graveyard. He goes back to the marshes with Biddy, and we see him returning to the same locations but with an alteration in his character. And notice how the mists from page 14 that were sort of hanging over the land, I'll read you the line from page 14. Which is this: the mist was heavier yet when I got out upon the marshes. This is when Pip's stolen the pork pie. The mists now had all solemnly risen, and the world lay spread before me. So the mist is a symbol for Pip at the start of the novel, not knowing anything, not seeing anything, being naive and innocent and dumb. And by this point, he's now he's on the next stage of his Bildungsroman. The mists have risen, he's now more knowledgeable, he can see more clearly, he can see his future destiny, and his way of life lays spread before him. He's got his great expectations ahead of him. Will they live up to expectation or not? So this final line of this volume reminds me of the final lines of Great Gatsby, and this fresh green breast of the new world, this sense of hope and opportunity, almost like the English version of the American dream for Pip. So that's worth a little bit of comparison as well. So the final slide of the presentation, I want you to think about a question, and I want you to have a go at writing a response, but I'm going to open it up a little bit this time. As you've written quite a few closed responses now, I'm going to give you the opportunity to make your own choice of what you're going to focus on. So let's have a look together. So, using any examples from any parts of Volume 1 of the text, I want you to evaluate the effectiveness of the methods used by Dickens to present the behaviour of individuals towards others based on their wealth and status. So within your answer, I want you to practice writing a general specific thesis introduction, and the thesis is really important there. Look at the bottom bullet point. You need to refer to it throughout using tentative language, so words like possibly, perhaps, maybe, could have, might have, and analytical verbs. Is Dickens criticising, warning, exposing? What is he doing? Is he teaching readers? So it's really important that your introduction gets that focus really clear, so that the set pieces that you choose, look at the second bullet point, can really link back to that. So I want you to choose two examples from Volume 1 to analyse the methods used by Dickens. You might choose Christmas Dinner in Chapter 4 and the Trabb's Boy scene we've just looked at in Chapter 19 to look at the way individuals alter their behaviour towards others based on their status and their wealth. Make sure that you include relevant context throughout. So you have that A3 sheet next to you. Why has Dickens possibly made things the way he has? What were the contexts of why he was writing this book? Was it a social justice novel? What was he trying to do? Okay, so no more than 2 sides of A4. A conclusion would be great as well, although I'm aware I haven't really talked to you about writing the best conclusions yet, but you can have a go. Again, if you have any problems or worries, just email me. I'll try to upload these to YouTube as well for anyone who can't access them, but just let me know if you have any problems. And that gets us to the end of Volume 1 of Great Expectations. So for next week, I'd like you to prepare by reading ahead, make sure you know Volume 2 really well, and Pip's time in London. Okay, thank you for listening, and I'll see you all soon.